The relationship between the UK and the EU is one that has been heated over many years, and yet it's one that hasn't been very much understood. It's only really in the last couple of years with the referendum that people have really started thinking about, well, how did we end up in the common market and then in the European Union? So this book is intended to give a short but hopefully interesting history of how we ended up in the European community and then Union, and what it looks like as we prepare to leave. I suppose my approach to the study of politics as an academic has always been one that thinks it's important to reach out to ordinary citizens, not just to academics or to students of politics, that the issues that we study are issues that resonate or should resonate with wider sections of the population. And so I always try and write in a way that's a little bit more accessible. It's not very steeped in theory, it's much more intended to be something that can be read by anybody. You know, not quite the airport bestseller, but something that if you were an interested citizen, not necessarily a student of politics, you might say, I really want to know more about that. "2018 is a fascinating time to be studying politics. That for many years people would say, oh, politics is a bit boring. But at the moment we have a situation in the United Kingdom, in Europe and in the United States, not to mention Latin America, where politics has changed so fundamentally. And while the rise of populism might be something that is a cause of concern among so-called liberal elites, it's actually something that's fascinating to study. And Brexit, the arrival of Donald Trump, the emergence of populism and illiberal democracy in parts of southern and central Europe all mean that there are new areas of study that give students of politics a lot to think about and a new focus for some of the research, so there are actually new opportunities. What I hope I've shown in the book is really the juxtaposition of British thinking about Europe and how in many ways that doesn't really fit with the European mainstream. The decision to stay out of the European communities in the 1950s arose because the UK felt its place in the world was quite different from that of continental Europe. And in many ways, that thinking persists in the 21st century. There was a period when Edward Heath was Prime Minister when maybe the view was the UK's place was at the heart of Europe. But although successive Prime Ministers talked about being at the heart of Europe, ultimately the United Kingdom has tended to feel that its interests are different from those of the European Union. At times they've coincided. When Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister setting up the single market, there appeared to be some convergence. But in many ways, the decision to leave seemed to reflect many of the views that were seen in the 1950s when the UK decided to stay out in the first place. The book is based in part on a history special subject I taught many years ago when I first came to Cambridge, which was looking at the integration process in Europe from 1973 to 1993, so very much the early years of British membership of the European Union. And over the years I'd thought, that's something that I'm interested in, but I'd parked it. So out came all the files and some of the primary documents that we've been using for the history special subject. But I also went back to some of the earlier thinking of the 1950s and then had a lot of interviews and much more contemporary material looking at the recent UK relationship with the European Union, which is something that I've studied and or been involved with for the last quarter of a century. So hopefully it brings academic rigour alongside some personal insight and an in-depth understanding of both the politics of the European Union and the politics of the UK. One of the abiding memories of the 2016 referendum was Michael Gove saying, well, I think we've all had enough of experts. Since the referendum, we keep hearing about people being so-called experts on Brexit, which I find a little odd, because Brexit hasn't happened. There's never been a member state leaving the European Union. Greenland left in the 1980s, but it was a slightly different situation, and it still maintains links with the EU because it's still part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union is something unprecedented, and we don't yet know how it's going to play out. So the idea that somehow we can have Brexit experts is an odd thing, but what we can do is look at what has happened in the past and also what the current legal order of the European Union is. So using academics to exchange ideas with politicians, I think, is important in terms of understanding what is EU thinking, how did the EU get to where it is in 2018, and what are the legal constraints on the UK's changing relations with the EU. It feels so long since I've been thinking about the UK's relations with the EU, and to some extent it's quite difficult to think that there's anything new under the sun. I think what might be more surprising for other people is the extent to which the discourse of the 1950s and 60s, when the UK stayed out, the language that was used in debates at the time of going into the European community, and the language in the debates when we decided to leave, actually all look quite similar. There was politics, there was economics. It's never been just an economic enterprise, nor has it ever just been about politics. Those two things have suffused debates all the way through. Actually, it was the referendum itself. Although the book goes back and looks at the nature of the relationship over 70 years, we had the 2015 general election, there was likely to be a referendum, and I was due to have a sabbatical in 2015-16. So I'd been in discussions with Routledge about doing a focus book, and the plan was to research it and write it during my sabbatical, and it would be published before the referendum. And then all of a sudden it became clear that the referendum wasn't going to be May 2017, which is what I'd been led to believe. It was going to be June 2016. And so I sort of was living with the referendum, trying to work at the same time, which made it an interesting experience. About a month before the referendum, I rang Cathy Hartley at Routledge and said, I've got a feeling we might end up with a vote to leave. If so, it might be a good thing to have the focus turned around as quickly as possible, because we'll want people to know what happened and why. If there's a vote to remain, then maybe we do a longer book and it'll have a longer shelf life. But even then, in May of 2016, I was suggesting that if there was a vote to remain, then maybe the final line would have been, but that wasn't the end of the story, because I didn't really think that a vote to remain was going to be one that the Leavers would settle with. It never occurred to me that if there was a vote to leave, we would, after 2 years, still be talking about possibly having another vote and possibly remaining. So it was a catalyst for a particularly productive time for me, but I think the subsequent couple of years mean there is plenty more scope for the next book. I have to say, I always find the process of doing the research more fun than the actual writing. Going away and finding out what people have said, and particularly looking at archival material or looking at Hansard and beginning to piece together the story, is what I really enjoy. Putting it down on paper I always find is the hardest aspect of it. But with this particular story of the UK's relations with the EU, it was actually quite easy to write, because it is such a powerful story and so many personalities to think about, as well as the politics behind the story. The Routledge focus format gives a clear set of constraints. That the danger, if you're an academic, is that you might ramble on for many hundreds of thousands of words, and in particular if you have a 70-year history to be writing, you could start writing and never end. Whereas the Routledge focus has two advantages. One, the maximum is 50,000 words, not a syllable more, not a letter more, and that means you have to be very focused, as it says in the title. You need to think through in advance, what do I want to say, how do I want to say it, and what is the best way of getting my message across. The other thing is, and this is really for the authors out there rather than for the readers, that Routledge turn focuses round really quickly. And this might be an exception, but my final afterword on the Gina Miller case went in late January, and the hard copy version came out on the 14th of February. That was pretty impressive. I certainly think people are more engaged in thinking about politics. When I was first teaching in Cambridge, if I told people I was studying the European Union, there was usually a little bit of a sigh and people said, I'm not very interested. Now, if I admit to teaching European politics, almost everyone will have a view. They will usually want to rehearse why they voted to leave the European Union or why they voted to remain in the European Union, but they want to talk about it. And I think that is a difference, that people seem to be engaged on the Brexit issue. Whether they feel responsible, I'm not sure. There are certainly some people who are campaigning for a people's vote to try and have another vote, essentially to overturn the results of the first referendum. There are people who campaigned actively for leave who have been criticised for perhaps not always abiding by the rules. I'm not sure they want to take responsibility, but there is definitely a sense that people are being held more to account. And I think a new sense of people thinking beyond party lines about how do we deal with Brexit. And then we're seeing some interesting alignments or partial alignments between Labour and the Conservatives over what sort of deal might be acceptable if one is finally agreed. So my academic background is I did philosophy, politics and economics at Oxford, and then a master's and a DPhil in European politics, focusing on the elections to the European Parliament. I think there was a lot of politics on the radio and television when I was a child, and my father, despite being a Labour voter, used to get the Daily Telegraph. So I was brought up as sort of an 8 or 9-year-old reading the Daily Telegraph, which might sound a bit pretentious, but that's what I ended up doing. But my father would also spend quite a lot of time shouting at the radio and television, being somewhat anti-Thatcher. So I grew up in a sort of political household, although my parents weren't involved in politics. And then when I was 11, the SDP was set up, and my local constituency was Crosby, where there was a famous by-election where Shirley Williams, one of the leaders of the SDP, was elected. So that's when I got involved, and I've been involved in politics ever since. Essentially, I am double-hatted between teaching European politics here in Cambridge and being a Liberal Democrat member of the House of Lords. So I do European politics in one form or another, almost 24/7, 365 days a year, because particularly I've only been in the Lords since 2014, and almost throughout my time there we have been thinking about having a referendum, legislating on having a referendum, legislating on withdrawing from the European Union, and then there is the prospect of a lot more legislation to deal with Brexit. So it keeps me quite busy. That seems to be 3 different questions which could go in all sorts of different directions. Am I a political anorak? Yes. Does that inspire my teaching? Probably. I think both my teaching and my writing are well informed, I hope, but I also think that they are accessible. I try to make them interesting and I would much rather make a clear case that is going to be easily understood and people say, oh, that inspires me to do more, than get involved in too much theoretical jargon, because I don't think that actually helps inform. The last book I finished reading was Robert Harris' Munich, which is a fantastic story and really fits with the sort of things I'm interested in, which link to security, intelligence and history. So a whole set of things that were fascinating. The one I'm in the middle of reading is by Shashi Tharoor, Inglorious Empire, about Britain's role in India, which is absolutely fascinating and very thought-provoking and quite controversial.